So Blaine, thanks for introducing me. I appreciate that. And thanks to all of you for coming. And thanks to the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And so just so most of you know, I'm actually not a public speaker. And so I don't do much of this, actually any. This is the first time I've ever done this. So I want to thank you all for sharing this with me. It'll be fun. I think this will be fun, right? So this is good. So I really wasn't sure why Blaine asked me, and I thought a lot about it. And as time went on, she asked me, I don't know, a month or two ago. And I thought a lot about it, and I thought, well, I'm a stakeholder in the Gulf of Maine. And I never really thought of myself as a stakeholder, but I have a business that relies a lot on tourism, and I spend a lot of time in the ocean. But all of us are stakeholders. We're all stakeholders in the environment that we live in, the Gulf of Maine, and really in the whole planet. So in that sense, I felt, oh, okay, that's a good fit. That's why. But the other thing is I'm also a longtime waterman. So I've been a sailor and an ocean swimmer and a surfer now for most of my life. And as a restaurateur, I rely pretty heavily on what happens, tourism, and without people coming in here and coming into my restaurants, I don't get to pay the college bursar. And anybody has any experience of that, you know how important that is. It's a pretty good motivator. And I've got to pay the mortgage as well. So this series of the Motion on the Ocean kind of, I don't know, I think Blaine hit that pretty good. You know, just think of the ocean and surfing and sailing and swimming and all that. And I am a stakeholder, and I care a lot about what happens in our environment on our beaches. And I see a couple of other surfers here in the audience, so we all probably share that. So I'm going to give this talk in sections, and what I really decided to do is talk about different things I've done in my life, and really just talk about what's changed and what I've seen, because I'm not a scientist. So Blaine very cleverly asked me not to use a lot of technical jargon, which I thought was kind of funny. So we would have like stuff like swim, saute, really outlandish stuff, and she just gave me a tour of the facility, and there was a lot of jargon, and I was kind of looking at her blankly like, okay, I'm not going to use any of those words, so we'll be all right. But the thesis of my talk is really one really simple idea, and it's not a scientific idea in any way. It's just that our best chance to change the world is to engage a lot of people one personal story at a time. And I don't know if any of you agree with me, but I feel like our environment's not only pretty important, but I think it's kind of at a crisis point. I feel especially that way since the recent election. And actually, I think you asked me to do this before the election, so I thought maybe we'd be in a different climate, different environment politically, which don't need to get into that. But the environment is really important to me. It's important to all of us. And I think the way I look at it is that it really affects all of us, what's happening in the environment. And the way that most of the stuff that we learn gets communicated is through scientific jargon. It's kind of, I think it's very difficult for people like me and a lot of people to really understand. And so what I'm going to try and do is demonstrate sort of another way to talk about what's happening in our world, and by personal experience, by story, just things that we've noticed. And I guess I believe that the best way to engage people is by doing just that, just to talk about experiences in our lives and make it so it's something people can wrap their arms around. So most people can't relate to science in the same way that scientists who do the data work can. And so it kind of goes, well, I don't know, maybe I'm just not that, I'm good at saute, but other than that, I don't know. So it kind of goes over my head when they start to talk about this, or even, talk about, oh, the ocean temperature is going to rise by so many degrees, and it doesn't really seem that much, and then you go out and our ocean out here, and it's 10 degrees warmer than it was last summer. That's, how come it only went up by a quarter of a degree? So it's not straight. But so to illustrate my point, I guess I'm going to just talk about an experience that I had. I had my first restaurant in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and I'm going to put this slide up there as well. I got to Plymouth, Massachusetts. I opened a restaurant there, and every place I looked, there was an ice house. And I didn't know what an ice house was. And Plymouth is a town that has a lake for every day of the year. So there's 370 some odd lakes. And I asked this guy, I'm like, what the heck is with all the ice houses? It's a favorite name for a restaurant in Plymouth, Massachusetts at the time. The ice house this, the ice house that, ice house cafe, the ice house bar. And he says, well, you know, when I was a kid, there were no refrigerators. We had ice boxes. And I said, well, I knew that. He says, where do you think the ice came from? I said, oh, I never thought about that. Well, we cut the ice out of the lakes. And I started to think about this, and, you know, I'm like a dunce. So, of course, you cut the ice out of the lakes. Go ahead, you're not going to bother me any. Go ahead in. And he said, yeah, but the remarkable part about it was the ice had to be cut out of 2-foot thick ice, and we finished cutting all the ice and putting it in the ice houses and packing it in sawdust by Thanksgiving. So think about that for a minute. So this year they had the Iditarod had to move, and they had the Sebago Ice Fishing Challenge had to, you know, move to a different lake further north, and that was in February. So this is non-scientific, just real day stuff that we can all relate to. The idea that the ponds were frozen enough in Plymouth, Massachusetts before Thanksgiving to fill the ice houses for a whole year, to me, I was dumbstruck by that. And so I give you a picture here as well, the Muir Riggs Glacier. I think this is a picture that was done by National Geographic. And you can see this is non-scientific. You just look at it and you say, how can that possibly be in 60 or so years that this thing, I guess I'm supposed to look at it up there, that thing looked so different at the same time of year. So anyway, that's my point. So I'm going to just go on. I'm going to talk about my life a little bit, some of the things I've observed in a very non-scientific way. And I'll throw out some theories that I think might be, you know, pseudoscience, and there'll be like a smoke thing that'll go off. Wrong, whatever. All right, so I grew up in Ohio, the son of intellectual university professors. My mother, the one with the cigar, and my father, the one with the chalk. My father was a nuclear physicist. He was actually a rocket scientist, and he was on the National Energy Commission, and super smart guy, an astronomer. My mother was a university calculus professor, wrote a couple of textbooks for university. But we were a pretty modern family, meaning in lay terms that there were a lot of divorces. And so I had several stepfathers. So one stepfather was the head of the ACLU for the state of Ohio, he's a lead lawyer. Another stepfather was as a concert pianist and a musician. And so I grew up in a pretty liberal home with a lot of liberal ideas and progressive ideas in a really scientific household. But like most kids, I wanted to do something completely different. My parents, I never really wanted to do math and science, and you know, that really landed on some pretty disappointed parents. But I did get the progressive roots and the environmentalist and the outside kind of piece. But I didn't get the science and math. My dad was crushed when I told him at age 13 that I wanted to be a chef. So I didn't fit the scientific mold, as you can tell by this early picture. I didn't fit that intellectual mold. But I did spend a lot of time with my family when they weren't doing their thing. You know, I didn't do a lot of rocket sciencing with my dad, but he did have a boat along with my grandfather, and I spent a lot of time on Lake Erie out in Ohio sailing, and we spent a lot of time skiing and just doing outdoors activities. But the other thing that we did an awful lot of was around the dinner table, and we did a lot of cooking. And so, you know, my dad really, in his spare time, he cooked, and in my mother's spare time, she entertained. And so I was the family butler, and I learned to cook a lot. And so that, compared with the sailing, I really was an avid sailor. I actually raced all different kinds of sailboats when I was a kid. And when I was 16, a friend of mine and I won the Rhodes Bantam Internationals, both the junior and the senior in 1 year. It's a pretty small class, but I was a pretty decent sailor at that point in my life. Well, I was able to combine my sailing experience with my cooking interest, and I went off to do the internationals there and sailing, and I went in the nationals. I kind of lost a place here, but let me just get back to that. When we did our international racing contest, it was in Erie, Pennsylvania, and it was on Lake Erie, and it was a mess. There were dead fish everywhere. And so you recognize that picture. That's right. Well, it was, well, all right. So you know what I was talking about. There were dead fish everywhere, and I grew up there, and I just thought it was normal. That was what it was. And everybody knew it was polluted. You know, the Maumee River would turn red every year when they were making tomato sauce, and there was a river there that caught on fire one year. And we all knew there was something wrong with it. but nobody did anything about it. And actually the title of my lecture today came from what we used to think was pretty funny when we were kids, and we would post a lookout on the bow of the sailboat, and we would say, oh, dead fish to port, dead fish to starboard. And then what happened was some people who had some pretty expensive yachts decided that it was kind of embarrassing to bring their people from away and take them on their boat and being, pushing dead fish out of the way. And so finally they cleaned up Lake Erie. But that's one of those kind of experiences where the science didn't do it, but the personal experience did. And that's kind of what I'm driving at. So after growing up in Ohio and doing a lot of sailing and cooking with my family, I actually combined those things, and I, with the cooking, and I ended up taking that interest, and I went off to Cornell University, and I ended up getting a degree in hotel and restaurant management and a minor in culinary arts. And my first real job after college combined those two interests in cooking and sailing, and I ended up in Newport, Rhode Island, right here. And I got my first, I guess I look back now, it really wasn't that real a job, but I thought it was a pretty real job then. I got a job cooking on a charter boat. And we met in Newport, Rhode Island, and that's kind of when my life as a sailor began. So sort of chapter 2 of this story is my life as a sailor. So I end up in Newport, Rhode Island. I'm a professional sailor, starting out as a cook. I took all that sort of pleasure sailing and racing. And I go to meet this boat. It was a Bowman 57 sailing boat. It was a ketch, and that was going to be my home for the next 3.5 years. I get down to Newport, Rhode Island in October, I guess it's September of 1980, right at the same time when Dennis Conner was winning the America's Cup on Freedom, which is shown probably the best picture in the whole lot that I didn't take a cell phone picture of a Polaroid with, but you can see that. Anyway, but one of the things that I remember, there's a lot of things I remember about that, but one of the things I remember the most, so you just got to think about this. I was just out of college. I'm going to go work on a boat. It's pretty serious. I mean, I had a couple of suits lined up in the DOP kit, but sort of typical of a kid going off to sail, and I'm in Newport, Rhode Island at the America's Cup, and we partied a lot. So we went off to these music venues and partied at night before we set sail. Well, the thing that I remember the most was that I could go to these bars, and I've got one pictured here. This is the old Ocean Mist, which has been there for years. Well, I went there, and you could walk all the way around it on the beach. And you can see now, this is a recent picture, there's no more beach. And so when I went back to Newport, Rhode Island, maybe 6 or 7 years ago just for a visit, I saw how much I lived in Newport for a month or so before we set sail for the Virgin Islands. And I recognized how much the water level had changed, how much higher the docks were, how much sand was gone. And it really struck me. I mean, there's nothing scientific about it, but it turns out that they've had the highest level of sea rise there of any place on the East Coast. They've had something like 10 inches in probably 30 years or something. And you can see it in pictures like this. So some other things that I noticed were pretty different, of course, were the tenfold increase in the cost of a yacht from when I was there. That's gone up a lot. And the harbor was a little bit more crowded when I was there than in 1980. So I got my berth on Kestrel, and we took off. We set sail across, and we were headed down to Tortola in the Virgin Islands, which is going to be where we were headed down for the Virgin Islands. And along the way, we got into a horrible storm. We went to Bermuda. And after that, we did some repairs. And we end up sailing south, and we get across into the Sargasso Sea. And another thing that I really remember, which is pretty remarkable, was going to sleep after my watch in the evening and waking up, and we were becalmed. We were actually becalmed out there for about 3 days. And waking up and coming up through the companionway and looking out early in the morning, absolutely flat calm. The boat is just standing straight up, and we are doing no motion whatsoever. And we were surrounded by long-finned pilot whales. I mean, when I say surrounded, I mean as far as I could see in any direction, thousands of them, probably thousands and thousands of them. And they were every place you could see, and they were just with us for the whole day, just basking in the sun. It was a beautiful day. The storm had passed, and it was calm. And I think that I am really sorry that I didn't take a picture of that, because I don't think anyone will ever see that again. So the long-fin pilot whales are not on the endangered species list. They're not actually protected. They're still hunted, and their population, I've read, has gone from the millions down to the hundreds of thousands, and I don't think that there will ever be a situation where there's 1,000 of those things surrounding a sailboat in the Sargasso Sea. Anyway, so that was a pretty amazing experience. When we did finally get underway and the wind picked up, as soon as we started to make a bow wave, it turns out that the dolphins commingle with the pilot whales. And so they were diving by our bow for about a whole day. We had dolphins with us, which is pretty interesting. Well, so off we sailed south. We sailed into the U.S. Virgin Islands at night, and we anchored in St. John, and in a place I had never been there. I didn't know what it was like, and we didn't have the World Wide Web then, so I didn't Google it, and I didn't have any pictures. And I just had it in my head it was going to look like the Bahamas. I thought it was going to be flat. And I came up out of the companionway in the morning after having a beautiful sound sleep at anchor in this peaceful anchorage, and this is what I saw. We were the only boat in the anchorage. It was completely deserted except for us. And the water, this isn't actually a picture. I wish I'd taken one then, but it looked just like that. That is actually St. John, and that's exactly how it looked. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm in paradise. I'm absolutely in paradise. It's the most beautiful thing I ever could have imagined, was these green mountainsides in the background and clear, beautiful water, and there was nobody there. And I was just stunned by that, and I thought that it was pretty amazing. Well, I started my life there. When I was there, I taught a lot of windsurfing. I don't know how you can even see those. These are, in fact, cell phone pictures of worn-out Polaroids that I took. But anyway, I don't know. I think it couldn't have been a Polaroid because that was an underwater camera, but I think they used to have a little disposable underwater camera. Anyway, I taught a lot of windsurfing, and I led a lot of scuba and snorkeling adventures. I was there for 3.5 years. But we did a lot of this, where we would be anchored in a little cove, and we would be the only boat. And it would be just like that. This also was not a picture that I took then. But that's what it was like when I was there. There was no one there, and it was kind of lonely. And I was, for the first 1.5 years, I was the cook and deckhand. And I was the odd man out, and the captain had his girlfriend. And so I was kind of alone. I was a 21 or 2-year-old guy living on himself with a guy and girlfriend, and I got to cook and wash their dishes. It was pretty sweet. But the big difference is now, if you look at the Virgin Islands, it looks more like this. It's a really big change. And so now it's still beautiful, but it's really crowded. In the 80s, most of the anchorages were completely deserted, maybe another boat or two, and at night we dropped our own anchor. We anchored wherever we wanted. There was no prohibition. Now it's packed. And it's not legal to drop an anchor in many places because they're trying to protect the reefs from damage. So the locals have placed permanent moorings, and you need to pay them to anchor. And the water is pretty clean, but it's not really as clean as it used to be. There's just a lot of stuff. But one of the things that was going on when I was down there was there was so little traffic, everybody had their head on their boat, and they would just pump and everything would go overboard because there was no pump out station any place in the Virgin Islands. So just raw sewage was going out of every sailboat that was down there. And when I was there, I would say that the number of charter boats and pleasure craft probably numbered in the few hundreds. Now I think it numbers in the tens of thousands. There are so many boats there, and of course they have in fact put in some pumping stations and whatnot over time, but that's a really big difference. But what changed the locality there from not having pump out stations for the heads to having pump out stations wasn't the pollution itself. It was the outcry from the visitors who were repulsed by the idea that they could see what they put in their toilet getting pumped out on the side of the boat and the fish feeding on it, which is kind of repulsive, really. So the other thing that's really happened in the time since I was there is the reefs are just not as healthy as they were. Some are dying. The rising water temperature is causing bleaching of the coral reefs. I think, from what I understand, that the coral has a bacteria on it that dies off when the water gets a little warmer, and the coral turns white and it gets brittle and then it breaks. And then with the coral, when that starts to die, also all the life that depends on that coral reef also either dies or goes away or moves away. And so this is a big difference, something that's happening there now. It's not in crisis stage, but it's an ongoing problem, another factor of temperature rise. The other thing is that when I was there, navigation in the Eastern Caribbean was much harder in the 80s than it is now. So when I was there was no sat-nav, there was no LORAN, there was no RDF, no radio direction finding, just because the radio stations there were so weak, just enough to broadcast to the station that you couldn't really pick up a radio station in order to use RDF. So the only kinds of navigation when I was there were celestial, with a sextant, or dead reckoning. And as a result, there were all kinds of million-dollar yachts that were sinking all the time. They would crash up on a reef. The outside of Anguilla was oh, I don't know, there were probably $100 million worth of modern yachts mixed in with all the old Spanish galleons that were there as well. But now, of course, you can use your cell phone to locate your bow and stern and your dock, I think, when you're down there, or you can use a sat-nav. But one of the biggest surprises I found very interesting, when I was there, water at the dock to fill up your water tanks was about 20 cents a gallon, and now it's only 15 cents. I don't understand how that could be. The only place where there isn't inflation. Well, so I was in the Virgin Islands for 3.5 years, and I left the Virgin Islands. It looks like I got a gas station job, if any of you remember those jackets that you had when we used to clean your windshield. Anyway, I opened a restaurant in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1983. It was a French restaurant named Santé. It was my first restaurant, and that was my sous chef who I had the whole time I owned it for 5.5 years. Some of the things I remember about being at Santé was, one of the things was we used to get scallops live in these shells that were, I don't know, the size of a dinner plate. And they would come to us in a bucket, and the fishermen would bring them to us, and we could open them and get these beautiful scallops, and we'd save the shells and do with whatever we want. What I think has happened now is that they learned that we actually got the whole scallop, so we got the gonad as well. You can see in this image, the red part is the gonad, which is very popular to be eaten all over Europe, although I don't think they do it as much now as they used to. But I think what they learned along the way was that the gonad is a really part of the reproductive process, so now scallops, I think because of regulation, are mostly opened by the fishing boat over the scalloping bed, and that gonad goes back on, and I don't, again, no technical jargon. Gonad was a big word for me. So we had that, and the scallops were amazing. We'll never see those again like that, I think. Another thing that was pretty interesting was I used to go fishing a lot with my sous chef, and one of the fun things, so we would work the night together, and then we would go off fishing. We'd go down to the harbor in Plymouth, which I've just learned is actually part of the Gulf of Maine. I didn't actually know that was part of the Gulf of Maine, so I'm glad I'm talking about it. But we would go down to the harbor, and we would catch menhaden, pogies, to use for bait, to go fishing with. And it was pretty easy. We'd spend about 10 minutes catching bait. We'd cast a big old treble hook out into the bay, and we would just snag along, and next thing you know, we'd snag a pogie, and we'd reel it in and put it in our bucket, and we'd do that 3 or 4 times, and then we'd get off and we'd go out to the beach, and we'd go striper fishing or catch either stripers or bluefish. But what I understand now is, and I saw it happen in the last couple of years that I was in Plymouth, that the menhaden stopped being so plentiful, and they would alternately rush up onto the shore somewhere where you had literally 10 million tons of them up on the beach, and they had to remove them for health reasons with a tractor, and then there wouldn't be any. And so I understand that the menhaden fishery is still pretty strong, but I wouldn't have known it from my experience there. The other thing that we had when we were in my first restaurant was an endless supply of trout in season. And when I say endless supply of trout, I mean that we actually would go in the mornings, and we would go trout fishing in one of Plymouth's lakes, and my sous chef was a very avid fisherman, so he knew where to go. And we never didn't catch enough trout to have for the restaurant menu. So we, in 2 seasons a year, we would have trout on our menu, and we would always catch them, and it was never an issue. That doesn't jive with my new experience of going fishing anymore. I usually come back, and if I've caught a fish, it's a remarkable day. So maybe I'm just not a very good fisherman. Could be. So I sold my restaurant in 1988, and I moved on to become the executive chef at the Bay Tower Room in Boston, which was on the 33rd floor of the 60 State office building, 60 State Street office building, right above Faneuil Hall Marketplace. And when I took that job, it was the 13th largest dollar volume restaurant in the country, and I thought that was a pretty big time for me. Had no idea what I was doing or how I was going to do the job, but at this time in 1989, 1990, swordfish was the biggest thing. Every restaurant anywhere had swordfish on the menu. It was very popular and very plentiful. The other things that were, I don't know, I think it was really before creativity had really hit the mainstream as a restaurant value. And every restaurant on the East Coast seemed to have lobster, scallops, swordfish, either haddock or cod, filet of sole or flounder, and salmon. And dishes like shrimp scampi and baked stuffed shrimp were still pretty common. Tuna hadn't gained much popularity, and there were very few exotic species, but a few of them were starting to creep into common usage restaurants. And then, of course, every restaurant had a steak menu, and now we don't see these things. But I actually got there, and I took my same approach to cooking and cooking ethics that I had in my little French restaurant, which only had 42 seats, to the Bay Tower Room, which was this ginormous restaurant. And I got pretty richly rewarded by doing that and taking that effort. And I got a 3.5-star review there, which kind of made my career. It was pretty good. But one of the things that really stood out to me was what the menu was and how it's changed. But also, I learned an awful lot by being right on the Portland Fish Pier, basically. So Faneuil Hall Marketplace was just across what used to be the Rays Central Artery from the Portland Fish Pier. And so we had the experience of buying fish right off the dock and finding out the multitude of ways that the fish vendors would alter it to fool you into thinking. So it was common. Scallops were big, and no one had ever eaten a skate there unless it was punched out to look like a scallop. And so we got sent all this stuff. Or they had invented, when I was there, I think during that time, they invented this product called tripolyphosphate. So now we all know we go into the fish market and we buy dry scallops, meaning they haven't been soaked in anything, to take on weight. Well, all this stuff was going on, and I got a real education in Boston. One of the things that's really changed, along with the menu choices, is that there's been a lot of regulation to control the fish industry, which protects everybody as consumers, which is a pretty great thing. So I did figure out along the way that being the chef in a great big restaurant like that was pretty different than being the chef and restaurateur in a little tiny restaurant. And what I learned actually was that being the chef and restaurateur in my little tiny restaurant was a heck of a lot easier. I like being a chef and restaurateur. And I have this little thing on here. As a chef, I don't know, you have to do all that stuff, I guess. So anyway, I went to Cornell, and I'm pretty thankful that I got my degree there. It really helped me a lot. But ultimately, I decided that I wanted to be back in business for myself. So I went up to Newburyport, and in 1990, I opened actually 2 restaurants in one building, but David's, and this is a picture of one of the restaurants inside that building. So I was there in Newburyport, and then in 1992, 2 years later, I opened my restaurant in Portland. But with that period of time, we started to do a lot of events, private events that I learned from being in big hotels and whatnot, and a lot of food experiences. But some interesting things that happened during that time. In 1992, the Atlantic cod fishery totally collapsed. We thought that, I kind of remember hearing people say that, jokingly, that back in the old days, you could walk from Boston to Cape Cod on the backs of cods, picking lobsters up out of the sea as you went. Well, that was no longer true, and the cod fishery collapsed. In 1993, the Atlantic swordfish was in deep trouble, and all of a sudden it became really endangered. So we'd gone very quickly from having swordfish be on every menu, any place in the eastern seaboard, to it was kind of like the veal thing. If you had swordfish on your menu, someone was going to throw rocks at your window. But by 1999, there was a protection plan put in place, and now that's one of the success stories in fisheries, one of the many, I think. But swordfish is now a pretty, I understand, I'm afraid to say this here. Blaine, am I right? Swordfish is still, I think it's a sustainable fish now, so I'm going to put it on my menu this summer. But at that time, in 1992, 1993, when I was opening my restaurants, we had plenty of flounder, we had plentiful halibut and haddock, and the halibut were as big as garage doors. They're enormous fish. And nobody was eating fish like hake or whiting. Nobody was eating pollock or ocean perch, which we call now, I guess, Atlantic redfish. No one was eating monkfish. Cape shark, dogfish, or tilefish. Those were things that they would never see ink on a menu. And so, of course, we know that that has changed a lot. And also, sometime during that time, I think it was very interesting, somebody in the marketing department someplace decided that they were going to start renaming fish so that they could sell them. I think one of my favorites was the slime head became the orange roughy, because who was going to order? I'll have the grilled slime head, please. Maybe braised slime head. I don't know. But anyway, so this was great because they sold a lot of orange roughy, except for the orange roughy, which became endangered almost instantly because no one knew that it took orange roughy 100 years to become sexually capable to reproduce, and they lived about 150 years. So they pretty much wiped out orange roughy in about 5 years. The other thing is Chilean sea bass, which is actually a real fish, but you've never probably actually eaten one. You probably ate something called the Patagonian toothfish, which got renamed to be Chilean sea bass. Neither of those fish fared very well. I think Chilean sea bass does still exist and it's protected, and the Patagonian toothfish was overfished as well. And I think those stocks are starting to come back. But I don't think I've seen Chilean sea bass on a menu now in about 10 years, where it was on every menu anywhere. So I went on and I moved. I opened my restaurant in Portland in 1992, but then in around 1999, I moved over to where we're located now on Congress Street. At that time, we had really a lot of interest in Asian fusion dishes. Everybody wanted to do something that was highly elaborate, super highly constructed dishes. If plates weren't 2 feet high, you were doing something wrong. And so we created some dishes to go with that. One of them is still on our menu today. We have this sushi rare pepper crusted tuna. Went on our menu in about 1994. It's totally antiquated. Why would anybody order that? But it's still our best-selling dish here now after however many years that is. And I think that's okay. I'm reluctant to say, but it seems like the yellowfin tuna fishery is kind of a moving target, but I think it's a relatively stable market fishery. Although one of the things that I've noticed, I don't have any science on this, but it seems like the size of the fish seem to be diminishing all the time. So I'm not a scientist, but it seems to me that that means that maybe the fishery isn't as stable as the people who are selling would like us to think it is. But by about the year 2000, I really started to think a little bit more about what we were serving on our menus. Prior to that, my thinking was primarily financially driven. I had started out at a young age owning restaurants, and we pretty much cobbled it together and scrambled to stay in business for the first 15, 18 years. And then all of a sudden we started to have a little more success. And then I started to get a little bit more globally thinking about what we were doing. But prior to that time, I was just buying fish that I could afford to sell, which kind of worked out well in the sense that I usually was buying things that were abundant, but abundant didn't necessarily mean that it was good for the fishery, as we saw with orange roughy and Chilean sea bass. And same thing with swordfish. Just because it was abundant and cheap, same thing happened to halibut. It was abundant and cheap too, and now you can't find a wild halibut very often. But then in 2005, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute opened, which who knew that? And so they opened this facility, and one of the things that happened was, and I don't know if you know this, Blaine, but it really had a big impact on a lot of us in the market. We got pretty aware of what was going on, largely because they had an outreach program. And GMRI was pretty responsible for a lot of local demand and some sustainable fish and some bycatch and some underutilized species that now are pretty popular. So I mentioned pollock and hake and some of these other fish. Well, we use these routinely now, and people have developed a taste for them, and a lot of times they're actually superior in flavor and texture to what people thought they would rather eat, which has worked out pretty well for the species that were being overfished. Along all this time, I was a surfer. So I started surfing back in 1978, but I didn't have a lot of ocean access until later in life. And but around 1992, I became a really avid surfer. When I say an avid surfer, I probably for the first 5 years that I became an avid surfer, I bet I was in the water 300 days a year. So I spent a lot of time. Around that time, 1993, the sea urchin was a pretty popular fishery here in Maine, and we wiped that one out in about 5 years. I think we watched the price of sea urchin go from about $4 a pound to where it stands now, about $22 a pound. And a pretty good example of what an unregulated fishery can do to itself in a pretty short period of time. It's kind of a tragedy. So one of the very dim bright sides of that, I guess, and this is a really dim bright side, is that I haven't stepped on a sea urchin while I'm surfing in Maine here in a while. So I'm unfortunate. I think I'd rather step on a sea urchin. But some things that I noticed in my surfing life here is I frequently surf at Scarborough and Higgins Beach, both of those. And when I started surfing back in the 1990s, the water always seemed clean and there was never a smell. I frequently would walk out and I'd step on a flounder as I was walking through the sand, and I almost never saw a jellyfish. We had seals as regular playmates, and we never saw sturgeon jumping. But we saw a lot of piping plovers on the beach. They were plentiful, and they were not yet under protection. Over the years, a lot of that has changed. So both of the beaches I regularly surf at now frequently have a bad odor, kind of like sewage. I don't really know why that is. It doesn't get talked about much, but I have a couple theories. So one is, I went to a beaches conference about 3 or 4 years ago, and I remember one of the big topics was pet waste and washing down through the watershed into the rivers and ultimately into the ocean. And it never occurred to me that that could be such a big impact, but evidently it is. So I think that poorly handled pet waste in the watershed is one of the reasons. And I think one of the other reasons, and again, I'm just throwing these out there, and I'm probably, you guys laughing up there? Yeah, okay. So I think that as the water level has risen, and I see all the seagrass in the salt marshes they're basically drowning. And I always understood that the seagrass had an awful lot to do with purifying the water, but I think that a lot of the seagrass is too deep in the water and it's dying. So that might be one of the reasons. Over in Scarborough, we have the smell of sewage pretty often there, almost all the time in the summer. And it didn't used to be that way. And I think that it's because, for whatever reason, we have Bloody Pond there, which has turned into some stagnant thing. Something has happened with the way the water runs in and out of that. I don't know what it is, but these are just observations I've made of things that have changed. I haven't stepped on a flounder in years, and I don't know why, because I understand that the flounder fishery is pretty lively, but maybe just not around the beaches. I've seen a lot of dead seals in the last few years, both pups and full-grown seals. And there seemed to be almost an epidemic of that about 3 or 4 years ago. It seems to have slowed down. But these are big changes. I didn't see that. And then, of course, the sturgeon, who we didn't see at all, now we see them jumping all the time. And these huge, I don't know if you've ever seen a sturgeon jump. They're remarkable fish. They look prehistoric. Sometimes they're 6, 7, and 8 feet long, and they get clearly out of the water. And I've often wondered if they're chasing prey or if they're being chased. So I went to read up about it, and I understand that there's a lot of unproven theories about why they jump. One of them is it's their way to communicate. It's not working because I can't understand what they're saying. The piping plovers are protected now, and they seem to be on the rebound, but it seems like it's kind of a fight between the foxes, which also have become far more plentiful because you can keep the dogs on a leash. I don't think they're having much luck keeping the foxes on a leash. So when you tell somebody you're a surfer, everyone asks what the biggest wave you've ever surfed was. So, yeah, that one's not me either. Yeah. You knew that neither of those were me, didn't you? That's right. Yeah. So I'm a surfer, but I'm not a nut. So those waves are both probably, one of them was probably, I think that one might be 60 feet, and I think that one might be 100 feet. Look how little that guy is. It's crazy. But everybody always asks you where you've been surfing. So, I surfed a lot, and I really got the bug in a big way. So in 2002, I had sold my restaurants in Massachusetts, and I had a little time on my hands. I only had one restaurant. Instead of, when I sold it, I had 2 restaurants in that building down in Massachusetts, and I just had the one restaurant on Congress Street. So life was pretty good, and we were doing pretty well. So I started this surf camp. So in 2002, we started this surf camp, and some of the things that we knew was that it was just plain and simple too cold to put a kid in the water until about the 15th of July. You just couldn't do it. Well, we ran 5 sessions those early seasons, and one of the things that we noticed then was we were at Scarborough Beach, and even in the highest tides and the fullest moon, even after a storm, there was still at least about a 30-foot margin from the highest tide water line to the dunes. Well, that's changed. Now, in our 15th year, last year, this will be our 15th year, last year was our 14th year, after having taught something like 1,500 young people how to surf. Some of the things that, well, the other thing we've taught them is how to be stewards of the ocean, which is probably the best thing that we do, because most of them don't continue on to surf. But we actually start our surfing camps now the 15th of June, because the water is so much warmer that it's predictably warmer. So we're in the water a month before when we were back 14 years ago. And that's a big change. So I know that the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest temperature changes of any body of water anywhere. But I hear these numbers like, it's 2 degrees, it's 2.3 degrees. We pretty frequently see water temperatures at the beach at 75 degrees now in the summertime. That is an enormous difference. So I understand that that's not the water flow, that's not the buoy temperature, but we didn't have that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, from my perspective. The other thing that's happened is the water level has changed. So as I said, when we were starting our camp, we had our gear up on the beach, and we had lots of margin of open beach, even on the heaviest high tides when there was a storm. But this last summer, in June, there was a moderate nor'easter that came through, and all of our equipment got washed away, literally washed right down the beach. And 3 different times over the course of the summer this last year, just at a high tide, all of our gear was soaking wet all the way up at the very edge of the dune. So there's a difference there. It's not, I don't know whether or not that's dramatic beach erosion, or whether or not it's rising water levels, or a combination of both. But I have also noticed that people are starting to pay attention to this over on Higgins Beach, and there's a lot of houses being put up on stilts over there. So that's a new thing as well. 2016, we saw the earliest lobster shed ever in mid-June, making a record lobster catch. I don't know about that. I was actually talking about Blaine with that. I have a theory that the lobsters are walking out of Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and they're walking to Maine to try and stay cool. And eventually they're going to walk right out of Maine, and they're going to walk right up to Canada. But she tells me that's not what's going on. We're feeding them, and that's why we're having more lobsters. But I think it's the water temperature that makes them shed earlier. And that just, my temperature gauge is my body. I stick it in the ocean a lot of hours, go surfing, and it feels a lot warmer to me, even in the winter. Another thing that's really changed is when we first started surf camp, we always did a cleanup day. So we would go around and we would pick up trash off the beach, off Starboard Beach. And so we used to collect something like 100 pounds of trash every time that we did a beach cleanup. And then around 2009, there was some work done to change the kinds of fishing gear. So all the floating lines went away, and then I guess again in 2014, I think that there was a ban, and then it got stiffened again. But what we noticed, which is a good thing, is the amount of trash that we collected has gone down by about 60%. So now when we do a beach cleanup, we only collect 30, 35, maybe 40 pounds at most. So we've gone down. So that's a good thing. It's an impact of paying attention. So I'm in the surfing business, and everybody in my family either surfs or hikes. So I got a couple of family pictures here to share. That's my daughter Emily on a ginormous wave at Starboard Beach. This is my daughter Ashley. We also like to hike and whatnot, and yes, that is our dog in the backpack. And there it's 2 of my sons. Dustin evidently has better balance than Kyle. You can see that. And then we are outside a lot, so we go on hikes and whatnot. We like to be outside, and that's really impacted our appreciation for the environment in general, just being out in it. But you see a lot of things that change. Along the way, we decided we were going to try and run a surf shop. That was in my garage. I think I still have all that gear. I've given a lot of away. It did not really work out. But along the way, the cooking got pretty serious. The Portland area got pretty competitive. Chefs got a little bit more creative. And we started to really start, does anybody notice there's a big focus on local? Everything's got to be local, which is good. Well, so you can see in this picture, I got some black truffles, clearly not local, and some fish fillet made from some local fish. And I just had to put that picture in there because I don't really get to work with truffles. That is actually a pound of fresh black truffles on my board, the one and only time that's ever happened in my life. So could not notice that. But I had a pretty good run. And so there are some places I actually did surf, and so there's a couple of other little family pictures of places I've gotten to go. I'll just run through these quickly. That's J Bay in South Africa. That's Namutu Island in Fiji, which is, you can't really tell how big it is from that picture, but you can walk around it in about 15 minutes. Surf there. That's Namutu Lefts in Fiji. I got to surf there. That's Malibu, California. Sayulita, Mexico. San Onofre, Southern California. I've been there about 6 or 7 times. That's also in Southern California, right up from that previous picture of Trestles. It's Playa Grande in Costa Rica. Tamarindo in Costa Rica. I just love to surf. And here we are at my favorite beach, Starboard Beach, in the winter. This is last winter, I think, with my son and a friend. I was the one taking the picture, so you don't see me, but we walked down through the fresh snow to catch some pretty good surf down there. And this is my other favorite beach. This is sea smoke coming off of winter swell at Higgins this last winter. Beautiful, beautiful morning right there. So my restaurants are growing. It's really become a family affair. I've got the whole family involved. You can see my daughter is in that picture there on the image on the left there. She's helping me out with a fundraiser for Share Our Strength a couple of years back. And on the right, I think she was making some salad for a soccer banquet, or maybe it was a hockey banquet or something like that. I don't know, a couple of years back. Business kept growing. I opened David's 388 in South Portland in 2007. Along the way, oysters have become really big business. I remember when I started out in the business, oysters were popular. There were some oyster bars around, but nobody really cared what oyster they were eating. So they would order a plate of oysters. Now, if you don't have 5 varieties of oysters and you have an oyster bar, you're in a lot of trouble. And if any of them are from out of the state of Maine, you may as well just throw them away because no one's going to buy them. So it's gotten to be now that oysters are sustainable. I don't think there are any wild oysters really being sold anywhere anymore. They're all aquaculture, which is a fantastic thing. It's a sustainable fishery. I have noticed, though, that over the last couple of years, the demand is outstripping the supply, and the oysters that are being farmed are getting smaller and smaller. I personally like an oyster that's, get an oyster in your mouth, but now it's twice as much money for an oyster that's only that big. So hopefully, $5 for an oyster. All right. 5 minutes? I got 5 minutes left? All right, I better move it along. All right. Well, I'll just skip the next 20 slides then. I opened David's Opus 10 in about 2012, and then David's KPT in about 2013. And one of the things I realized after I opened David's KPT was that we really had become a brand that used a lot of fish. I really had never thought about that before, but we started using tens of thousands of pounds of product, and it occurred to me that I was part of the problem in a lot of places, and so we started to think about what we were buying. We started to get serious. These are some estimates about what we used last year. We used we used about 6,000 pounds of lobster meat. That's about 36,000 pounds of live lobster. We used about 6,000 pounds of scallops, 7,000 pounds of tuna, 75,000 Maine oysters, about 12,000 pounds of haddock, 4,000 pounds of hake, 3,500 pounds of swordfish, 4,000 pounds of calamari. It's a lot. And it occurred to me that I really hadn't considered the footprint that I was leaving on the planet and in the ocean. And so we really have started to think about that before we put things on a menu. It's gotten to be where, when I had one little restaurant, my first little French restaurant, I probably bought 700 pounds of seafood the whole year. It didn't really matter what I did. Now it really does. So I've estimated that I spend between 300 and 400 hours a year in the ocean surfing or swimming. I've been doing that for about 25 years, maybe 10,000 hours in the water. So I've got really wrinkly hands. So I'm literally in the soup. And I have kind of come to believe that surfers and ocean swimmers are very much the canary in the coal mine for the condition of our coastal waters. Even more so than scuba divers, pretty much than anybody. There's a lot of people that are on the water in ships, and they spend a lot more time on the water. But being in the water, you're actually in the environment. And when I think about that, I think about, you've probably all heard this, but they say that if you put a frog in water and you turn the burner up really slowly, the frog will stay in there and fall asleep and die. If you turn the water up to a boil and you throw the frog in, he'll jump right out. Well, I think that as human beings, we're kind of like the frog in water that's just getting turned up really slowly. And as a surfer, I feel like I'm in that pond. I'm kind of paying attention. And I haven't made a single scientific observation, but over 30 or so years of being in and on the water, I've noticed a lot of changes, and it's a little scary to me. So I think we're in some hot water, really, literally and figuratively, whether you're at your own local beach. This is a beautiful sunrise picture at Higgins, or a beach far, far away. That's Tamarindo. I was there in October. I took that picture. I think we have the right stuff. Anybody recognize? Come on, that's like from the movie, right? Remember the right stuff? They're walking away. Anyway, we'll have the right stuff to make an impact on our planet, to be mermaids for change. So I want to leave you with one thought before I end. McSpymic, obviously, right? Measured, constant, steady pressure yields measurable change. So where I got that is when Blaine asked me to do this, she said the theme of the talk was going to be the motion of the ocean. And I thought a lot about how that engaged me, what that made me think about. And, you know, at first I rolled it around and in my head, and I kind of thought literally, so I started thinking about, ebb and flow and flood and slack. And then I thought more whimsically about it, and I thought about waves of emotion. And then I thought about waves of change. And that really kind of hit me. I'm like, okay, the motion of the ocean, waves of change. It kind of really works for a surfer. And so I really thought that waves of change really kind of indicates how the motion of the ocean is really a metaphor for change. Then I thought about it a little bit more. And I pondered the phrase motion of the ocean as a simile. And I thought a lot about it, and I found that I thought that the word motion is to the word direction as the word ocean is to the word fluid. So the word ocean, found that the word motion is to the word direction as the word ocean is to the word fluid. So I put those words together and I got motion fluid. And then I turned around and I got fluid motion. And that really hit me. I'm like, okay, fluid motion, right. So to me, fluid motion is a great way to talk about change. It's dynamic, it's steady, it's constant, and it's measured. It's like a wave, and how appropriate for a surfer. So in closing, the message I want to leave you with is to say, to work for and be part of a fluid change. McSpymic, measured, constant, steady pressure yields measurable change. So I believe that the impact of small actions taken by the many far outweigh big actions taken by the few. And I think that in my own little way, I don't really understand science as well as a lot of people do, but just telling the stories, the personal stories that we've all experienced is a way. I think our best way to change the world is to engage a lot of people, one personal story at a time. So with that, I leave you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
It was my pleasure.
Folks, it's almost 8 o'clock. We probably have about 5 minutes. If anyone has questions for David, I'm sure he'd be willing to take a question or two.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Just had a quick comment. You reminded me, and I love your observations, and I don't think they should be discounted because they're not science per se. But I think it was in the New York Times, someone had uncovered decades of photos of this, one of these boats that takes people out fishing. And when they come back, they hang the fish, like from the 1950s through like the 1980s. And what this person observed over the years, the fish were getting smaller, every year. So in the 1950s, these fish were bigger than the men that were catching the fish. And by the 1980s, they were...
You sure the men just weren't getting bigger? Yeah.
So it was just similar to what you're describing.
Well, and the observation that those photos made with the fish is I've seen it as a fish buyer. I mean, it's unbelievable. The bluefin tuna used to be 2,600 pounds. Now, if they catch a 1,000-pound bluefin, that's a rarity. Or, the swordfish were bigger, the halibut were bigger. Everything was bigger. And now, maybe there are more fish, but not as big. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming out.